Welcome back, guys. In this video we're going to be going over requirement 2. So let's get started. Requirement 2 may be one of the longer requirements of this Merit Badge to review, so let's have a look at what we need to do. In the workbook we have several terms with space to write down what each is, but the requirement is to discuss only 5 of them. We also need to describe how the terms we select relate to a specific game. So what will this video cover? We will be going over game design terms, more game design terms, and you guessed it, more game design terms. We're going to cover terms in the categories of thematic game elements, gameplay elements, game analysis, and some related terms. Since I can't pick the 5 game design terms you document, we're going to cover all 17 in the workbook. Okay, let's get started. Story, which you can find on page 47. There are 2 types of stories: narrative stories and player-created stories. Narrative stories, also known as plot, are created by the game designer. As the book notes, a well-written story can compensate for bad gameplay. However, a poor story can ruin the game experience even if the mechanics of the gameplay are solid. For player-created stories, these are stories that tell what the player has done in the game. All games have these in one form or another. The book gives an example of this with a line from a baseball-themed game. Their batter smacked a line drive towards right field, but Johnny made a leaping catch, whirled, and zipped the ball to first base for a double play. Okay. Now our game example. For this we will go with the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim for a narrative story due to its main quest story. And we're also going to use Madden for a player-created story for some play-by-play commentary based on what the player is doing. Alright, setting, which you can also find on page 47. The setting of a game, the fictional environment in which it occurs, can have a big impact on the play experience. As the book notes, different settings can have a different emotional hook, like a zombie survival game compared to a fantasy sports game. Our example game is Star Wars: The Old Republic. The setting the player experiences choosing to play as a Sith Inquisitor has a different intro than the player that chooses to play a Jedi Counselor. Now, characters, which can be found on page 47. Game characters can have a similar impact as setting if the player character has loosely defined personality, such as Chell from Portal and Master Chief from Halo. The player can project his or her personality onto that character. Characters can be more pronounced in RPGs, letting you make the character what you want. Our example game is the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim for its mechanics that let you customize your character. Play sequence, which you can find on page 48. Whose turn is it? Do we take turns? Can we play at the same time? The play sequence of a game answers these questions. Our example game for play sequence is Magic: The Gathering. There are certain cards called instant cards that allow a player to make a move during any phase of play, whether it's their turn or their opponent's turn. Okay, for level design, which is found on page 48. Level design, or environment design, is the process of creating game spaces. The level design is separate from rules and mechanics. There may be rules that reference spaces created by level design, but not necessarily where those spaces are located. Our example game comes from the book. In basketball, the placement of the three-point line on the court is a product of level design, which what happens at the three-point line is a product of the rules. Interface design can be found on page 49. Interface design is the process of developing effective methods for communicating information between players and games. Interface is the exchange of information between the player and the game. Things like the UI in video games, game cards in a card game, dice, and rule sheets are ways to communicate information with the player that allows them to play the game. Our example game for this is Magic the Gathering, specifically the game cards. The backs of the cards have a standard design to allow shuffling in a random order. The fronts of the cards have a graphic representation, shows the card's attack power and toughness, and any special abilities the card has. Alright, difficulty can be found on page 50. Difficulty describes how easy or hard it is for a player to complete a game objective. Degrees of difficulty can be adjusted by the designer. The book gives an example of this. You can make a puzzle harder by increasing the number of steps to complete it, increasing restrictions on the player, or reducing the amount of time the player has to complete it. Our example game for this is Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion. The difficulty setting when starting a match affects the AI units, or artificial intelligence, basically the computer. If you have a harder difficulty setting, it makes the AI more aggressive, build faster, and bring more and tougher ships to attack. Now, balance. This one can be found on page 50. Balance is a description of the relative strength of different resources, mechanics, objectives, or starting states. Balanced games do not give unequal advantages or disadvantages to any player. Our example game is Rock, Paper, Scissors. In Rock, Paper, Scissors, player skill and some luck can allow a player to win more often than not, but winning is not a result of the rules or game mechanics favoring them. Okay, we're at the halfway point now. Depth is found on page 51. Depth refers to the ability to continue to find enjoyment in a game as one's skills improve. The book mentions that depth is related to complexity, but is different. Complexity refers to the number of rules or the number of elements with which a player interacts. Increasing complexity doesn't mean you are increasing the depth of the game, though. Our example game is chess. As you become more skilled in chess, you will find you have more options available to you for sequences of moves. But the game itself does not get more complex and stays as basically pieces on a board. Alright, time for pace. This is found on page 51. Pace describes the speed of a game. Specifically, it is how quickly the player receives information and makes decisions. Our first example is Risk for a slow-paced game. This is a turn-based strategy game without turn time limits. You can make plans during your opponent's turn based on their moves and take your time making your own moves. Our second example is StarCraft for a fast-paced game. This is a real-time strategy game that requires you to make decisions and moves based on events that are occurring as you are making those moves. Now, replay value, which is found on page 52. If play value is the reason someone plays a game, then replay value is the reason someone plays a game over and over again. Replay value is subjective and is usually expressed in terms of the audience the game is geared towards. Audience is basically the type of people the designer feels is likely to play the game. Certain play values that particular audiences experience will give a higher replay value for those players over others, meaning a first-person shooter game will likely have a higher replay value for fans of that genre versus fans of puzzle games, even if puzzle game fans enjoy playing that game. Our example game is Battlefield 4. There are several players that continue to play the game even after they have ranked to the highest level and even after they have unlocked their favorite weapons and gear. Alright, time for age appropriateness. This is found on page 52. Age appropriateness refers to the age or maturity level of a game's intended audience. There is a section on the side of the page stating the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, is a nonprofit group that assigns age appropriateness ratings to electronic games. These ratings help players and their parents identify games with suitable content. These ratings are displayed on the front and or the back covers of a game. You'll see labels like E for everyone, E10 plus for everyone 10 years and older, and even M for mature, depending on the rating given. Our example game is Lego Lord of the Rings, which has a rating E10 plus for everyone ages 10 and up. There is a URL on the screen to an entry on Common Sense Media for this game. The link will also be in the video description. Alright, we're finally to the related terms section. We'll start off with single player versus multiplayer on page 53. If a game is played with only one human player, it is said to be a single player. While this term mainly applies to electronic games, card games such as Solitaire are also single-player games. Games with more than one player are multiplayer. Some electronic games include both single-player and multiplayer modes. So, obviously single-player is one player, and multiplayer is two or more players. Our example game is Total War Rome 2. There's a single-player campaign mode where you can play alone against the AI, and there's a multiplayer campaign mode where you can play with or against another person. Okay, how about cooperative versus competitive on page 53? While many multiplayer games are competitive with clearly defined winners and losers, others are not. Cooperative games require players to work together to complete objectives. Some games can have competitive and cooperative elements in play at the same time. Our example of this is football. This team-based game puts two teams playing against each other, but this requires cooperation between fellow teammates. Alright, Now let's do turn-based versus real-time. This is found on page 53 as well. Most board and card games are turn-based, allowing one player or team to control the play at any given time, and then switching control to the next player or team. Some turn-based games also have simultaneous play, which means that more than one player or team can act at the same time. In a real-time game, all players act at the same time throughout the game. Our first example is blackjack, which is turn-based. After the cards are dealt, each player makes their decisions one at a time. Once they are finished, it goes on to the next player until it's the dealer's turn, and then that round is finished. Our second example game is StarCraft. This real-time strategy game has players making moves and decisions all at the same time without waiting for the other players to make their moves and ending their turn. Okay, 2 more to go. It's time for strategy versus reflex versus chance, which is found on page 55. Strategic, or mental, and reflex, or physical, gameplay are different expressions of player skill. In both cases, the player has control over the outcome through his or her decisions and actions. By contrast, chance-based mechanics have a randomized outcome. So, strategy and reflex involve things in the player's control, whereas chance involves things not in the player's control. Reflex can be considered both mental and physical. The mental side of things being reaction times, and the physical side being responses to go along with those reactions, like identifying someone throwing a ball at you, then dodging. Our first example game is chess. Chess represents strategy through the moves you make with your playing pieces on the board. Our second example game is Battlefield 4. This one represents reflex through reacting to other players and what is going on around you in the game. Our third example game is the casino game Roulette. Roulette represents chance for not allowing the player to influence the ball as the wheel spins, unless you're cheating. Okay, last one. Time for abstract versus thematic on page 54. While many games are thematic, as discussed earlier, some are abstract, meaning they don't incorporate non-game information into the game. To revisit what thematic is, on page 47, we were introduced to thematic elements, which are things like the story, setting, and characters. Our first example game is Tetris. This is our abstract example since there are no story, setting, or character elements in the game. Our second example game is The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. This is our thematic example since it has a main storyline, a detailed setting and intro sequence, and customizable player characters. Okay, that was a lot to go over, but thanks for hanging in there, guys. Next up, we'll be going into what you need for requirement 3. See you in the next video.